Some people will tell you that revenge isn't worth it, that it poisons the soul, that it makes you just like the person who hurt you. I used to believe that too until Ethan Hayes wasn't just my boss. He was my mentor, my friend, the man who'd promised to make my career. When I first joined Westbrook Financial, I was naive enough to think that hard work was all it took to move up. I was wrong. What really mattered there was loyalty, or at least the illusion of it. Ethan had that illusion perfected. He was the kind of man who could make an intern feel like a partner just by remembering their name. Charming, confident, expensive, the kind of person who filled a room before he even spoke. Everyone adored him, especially me. For 2 years, I followed every order, pulled every late night, fixed every mistake he made without a word. I thought he noticed. I thought I mattered. Then came the audit. It started small, a missing signature, a misfiled expense, nothing alarming. But when corporate sent their investigators, the whispers began. Someone had manipulated financial reports to cover personal spending, thousands of dollars in client funds missing. And somehow, all of it pointed back to me. The first time I realized I was being framed, it felt like a bad dream. My name was on the reports, my login credentials stamped on every document. Ethan stood beside me in meetings, hand on my shoulder, pretending to comfort me while feeding me to the wolves. "I'll handle this," he'd said in that soothing voice of his. "Just stay quiet. Let me talk to the board. We'll clear your name." But he never did. By the time the investigation ended, I was fired for cause. No severance, no references, no dignity. HR escorted me out of the building like a criminal. I remember turning around one last time. Ethan was standing in his office window, arms crossed, watching me leave with that same calm smile. 2 weeks later, a press release went out. Ethan Hayes had been promoted to Vice President of Finance, the position I was supposed to get. My project, my work, my numbers were all credited to him. He'd stolen everything. For months, I sank into nothingness. My savings dried up. Friends avoided me. The industry whispered that I was unreliable. But there's something about rock bottom that clarifies who you are. I stopped crying. I stopped drinking. And I started watching. Ethan liked to think he was untouchable, the golden boy of corporate America. But he'd forgotten the one person who knew exactly how he operated. I knew his passwords, his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, I knew what he was hiding. You see, Ethan's mistake wasn't just greed. It was arrogance. He'd used the same tricks on other people: fake numbers, ghost clients, offshore accounts disguised as consulting fees. I'd seen the files once, hidden deep in the server. I hadn't understood back then what I was looking at. But now I did. I made a plan. Not a rash, emotional one, a careful, surgical one. First, I'd get close again. Not to Ethan, to the people who trusted him. The ones who'd never suspect he was capable of betrayal. Second, I'd collect evidence. Real evidence. And third, when he least expected it, I'd make him watch his world crumble, the way he'd made me watch mine. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a strategy. The trick to getting back in was simple. Don't go through the front door. Ethan built his empire around appearances, speeches, charity galas, glossy LinkedIn posts, and that meant there were dozens of doors he never bothered to lock. People like him leave trails of glitter and shortcuts. They believe flattery covers tracks. That arrogance became my map. I started small and slow. I created a new identity in the industry: neutral, polite, and remarkable. A consultant who specialized in compliance reviews for boutique firms. I registered an LLC, built a bland website, and networked at the fringes where Ethan's circle never looked twice. You'd be surprised how quickly people will volunteer the things they think don't matter to them: gossip, bragging, even confessions, when they aren't threatened. At conferences, I watched him on stage from a distance. Watched how he milked applause, how he smiled at cameras. I took notes on his cadence, the names he dropped, the vendors he praised. In bars after panels, executives loosened their tongues. "Ethan's a genius," they'd say. "He's got a line on offshore consultants who do wonders with tax dispersion." They'd laugh, clink glasses. And none of them feared the consequences because Ethan was their golden ticket. My first real inroad came by accident. A mid-level manager at a rival firm, Maggie, reached out after reading one of my bland blog posts. She'd been burned by a consultant and wanted due diligence. We spoke for an hour. She was sharp, anxious, and hungry to prove herself. When she mentioned Westbrook and casually named Ethan as a consultant to watch, I leaned in. Her fear told me more than any document had. She'd seen irregular invoices slip through the cracks and heard the hush from finance about creative accounting. She had nothing to prove it, only a sense that the numbers didn't add up. That's when I began to rebuild my dossier. Not the emotional, disjointed one that had burned me before, but a lawyerly, methodical file that would stand up under scrutiny. I started pulling public filings, fully accessible records, and archived vendor lists. I cross-referenced expense codes across years and companies. It was tedious and satisfying in equal measure, like stitching a seam that had once been torn. I also went back into the places he'd thought were private. Ethan loved convenience, a single-use password here, a shared drive there, a contractor who was careless with logins. I was careful, surgical. I never used anything that could be traced to me directly. I rented servers under my LLC, used VoIP numbers, and routed everything through proxies. For weeks I watched, like a patient hunter waiting by a dried stream. One night, masquerading as a potential vendor representative, I called a small contracting firm Ethan used for branding shoots. The woman who answered was chatty and underpaid. Freelancers always are. She bragged about the generous retainer Westbrook paid and slipped, offhand, the name of a shell company they used for payment processing. The number she gave me led to a dead-end or prepaid card tied to a mailbox in a state 3 time zones away. But the trail existed. The deeper I dove, the uglier the pattern became. Shell vendors, phony consulting agreements, invoices padded with travel expenses that never matched flight logs. Ethan had perfected a system that funneled cash in whispers. He'd put his signature beside mine once to cover a deadline. Now those signatures were everywhere. The files I'd seen months ago weren't an anomaly. They were his blueprint. But evidence is only valuable when it's credible. Anyone can point fingers. The law wants receipts. So, I started manufacturing opportunities for receipts to appear naturally: audits, reconciliations, vendor verifications, the kinds of mundane, bureaucratic routines that force sloppy work into the light. I contacted compliance officers, old colleagues, people who still believed in the myth of Westbrook's integrity. I offered my services free in exchange for access to archives and vendor contracts. People love free things. They're even more gullible when the free thing offers prestige. One audit I talked up led to an entire drawer of mislabeled contracts. Another conversation prompted an HR lead to dig through a backup server that, years ago, had been forgotten during a migration. Each discovery fed another. Each small reveal was a breadcrumb I stashed away. I cataloged account numbers, cross-matched contractor addresses, and traced payments overseas. I copied everything: spreadsheets, PDFs, scanned receipts into an encrypted archive. My hands stopped trembling. The plan was taking shape. There was a cost to moving like this. I had to watch while Ethan charmed the room at a luncheon I'd infiltrated, pretending to pitch a pro bono compliance workshop. He laughed at my jokes, shook hands with people who would later vouch for him. I feigned respect, wrote notes, and felt a bile I won't pretend was noble. Revenge had started to consume small parts of me, the parts that once loved the ease of collaboration and late-night brainstorming. Sometimes I wondered whether I was becoming what I hated. But then I'd open another file and find another forged invoice, and the questions would quiet. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a junior bookkeeper named Tomas who'd been too afraid to speak up. He messaged me on LinkedIn after I'd attended a webinar he'd co-authored the week earlier. He'd anonymously posted about odd vendor payments. He trusted me enough to open up. He had an external hard drive with downloaded transaction logs he'd been too scared to submit to HR. He wanted out. He wanted the world to know. We met in a diner at midnight. Tomas slid across the hard drive and a trembling folder with passwords scribbled on post-its. He confessed how Ethan had bullied him into approving payments, how the boss's voice on the phone could reposition a conscience. He makes it sound like patriotism, Tomas whispered, eyes darting. Like we're doing work for the greater good. I looked at the files in the flickering booth light and felt a cold rush. The directory names matched the shell companies I'd unearthed. There were emails with approving signatures, scanned receipts, and an Excel sheet with pivot tables showing transfers timed to coincide with quarter closings. Tomas hadn't known how to interpret it, but I did. To him it was frightening. To me it was leverage. That night we left the diner as conspirators, not friends. I encrypted backups on multiple drives and seeded innocuous copies in places that would look like genuine leaks if surfaced, a consultant's folder here, a disgruntled contractor's backup there. I learned to think like a journalist and a prosecutor at once. Keep the facts accessible but the motive ambiguous. Let the facts speak. Let the motive be someone else's guess. I also started whispering into the right ears. Not with malice, but with careful phrasing. Have you ever audited vendor X? Did you see the payment to vendor Y last year? Questions, not accusations. Curiosity, not condemnation. People who were already uneasy began to push. Maggie, the manager from the rival firm, began asking her compliance team to review shared vendors. One small investigation led to another. Ethan remained untouchable in public. He still smiled, still won awards. But behind the curtain, the seams were loosening. The executive assistant who once called me by name at reception stopped returning his emails. The contractor who managed creative budgets had his account frozen for verification. Small fissures became cracks. I kept moving pieces into place, never revealing myself. I fed evidence to journalists anonymously, handed secure copies to an attorney friend who had the stomach for corporate litigation, and made sure there were people inside Westbrook who could not unknow what I'd found. Seeding doubt was the most powerful weapon. Once doubt exists in an office built on reputation, it spreads faster than any memo. When a mid-level compliance officer finally opened one of the encrypted files and saw the invoices mapped against transfers, the silence in that room must have sounded like thunder. I watched from a distance as internal calls multiplied. I let them do the glamorous work of verification and audits, the subpoenas, the uncomfortable meetings, while I stayed in the dark, collecting my breath, waiting for the right moment to move to the final phase. Infiltration, I learned, wasn't about brute force. It was about replacing certainty with questions and giving those questions the fuel of proof. Ethan had always depended on the world's willingness to admire him rather than examine him. I made that world examine. And in the doing, I found that my anger had sharpened into something that resembled clarity. I was still the man they'd fired, but I wasn't the same man at all. The fall had hollowed me, and the infiltration had filled me with a purpose that wasn't about punishment alone. It was about truth, and when people finally saw the ledger, when the transfers and signatures lined up, and the shell companies blinked like exposed wiring, I wanted them to know why the lights had gone out. When momentum shifts in your favor, it feels less like triumph and more like the moment before the roof caves in. The pressure builds, and you can hear the boards creak. That's how it was after the audit findings started to accumulate like a house settling toward its end. Ethan didn't fold. He went medieval. He fired lawyers with reputations for putting generals back on their feet. He hired private investigators who traced my online breadcrumbs. The phantom consultant Mark Daniels I'd invented. The late-night diner meetups with Tomas. They filed subpoenas, froze accounts, and tried to squeeze witnesses into silence with threats of litigation. A team from his new legal firm called Tomas's parents, asked awkward questions, and suggested the boy might be misremembering details under stress. Claymore tactics, ruthless, predictable. For a few days, I watched as the machinery of defense tried to suffocate the truth. Ethan smoothed his public image. He did interviews where he spoke in comforting platitudes, painting the audit as a bureaucratic snag, a misunderstanding. He launched an internal task force to review process integrity, a shiny move designed to look proactive while he stacked allies around him. But he couldn't erase what had already leaked into the wild, the money trail, the contracts, the memos. When the press started asking pointed questions, the board stopped smiling in public. It wasn't just a corporate war. It became a psychological one. Ethan put out feelers to people I knew, former coworkers who still held a soft spot for me or owed me favors. He called them late at night and painted me as unstable, a man whose termination had embittered him into a vendetta. They were torn, some out of loyalty, others out of fear of being dragged into a legal storm. A few backed away. One friend called me to say, with shame in his voice, that Ethan had offered him a promotion if he testified to the environment being chaotic. They were buying silence with futures. It was a low, old tactic, effective because it smells of legitimacy. Despite the pressure, fractures widened inside Westbrook. The contractors who had once been paid without question were suddenly asking for receipts. The compliance officer who'd once shrugged at odd line items found her career reoriented. She suddenly cared. Whispers turned into memos, memos into subpoenas, and before long, external counsel began to threaten criminal referrals. I remember the exact moment I realized this wasn't going to be just an internal scandal. A nighttime headline pinged on my phone. Westbrook under probe, regulatory authorities involved. The headline was clinical, but the implications were enormous. But for all that, Ethan struck a different, more personal blow. In a calculated move that displayed his worst instincts, he found a way to weaponize the one place I thought untouchable, my family. He gathered snippets, sold rumors about my marriage, offhand comments I'd made in a harsh moment, a text message clipped and framed to look vindictive, and he disseminated them to a few select reporters who loved the human angle. The next morning, my sister texted me a link to a piece that mischaracterized me as a bitter ex-employee obsessed with revenge. Claire saw it too. Small town, small news, big wounds. She called once, then twice, her voice clipped, then gone. That was the sharpest cut. When he hit where I lived, not just where I'd worked, the landscape tilted. People I'd relied on began to hesitate to be seen with me. The freelance gigs I'd lined up softened or vanished. For a moment, just a moment, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Had I traded everything for a vindication that would never bring back what I'd lost? If I doubted, I didn't show it. I had to move. The fight had become not only about exposing a criminal but about protecting the people who had already risked themselves to help me. Tomas, for one, was terrified. His hands trembled when we spoke. He'd been dragged into interviews, his emails demanded, his life laid bare. I promised him, in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt, that I had a plan to insulate him. I wired him a small sum under the table money to secure a motel room, to get him away from prying eyes. It was ugly, secretive help, the sort that leaves behind a residue of shame. But he needed it. I also decided to change my mode from anonymous architect to active participant at a place where I could hurt Ethan in a way that mattered. I applied for a temporary contract at a boutique forensic accounting firm that had been hired to assist with the audit. I wrote a bland, professional cover letter, vetted my name's baggage, and presented myself as a consultant who knew the industry. They took me on as a short-term contractor because the firm needed someone who could parse the oddities quickly. It felt risky, like walking into the lion's den, but it was necessary. Working inside, even temporarily, gave me a view of the machinery that was grinding up reputations. It also gave me leverage. I found documents I hadn't expected, internal memos that suggested the board had had suspicions long before I'd started poking, and a cache of emails showing that Ethan had attempted to influence an outside auditor with soft suggestions about which accounts to prioritize. A psychiatrist might call it obsession. I called it focused revenge. I took digital scans, made copies, and hid them in encrypted locations. Every piece I gathered was a nail in the coffin. Ethan responded by intensifying his public defense. He hired PR. He did interviews where he framed the entire situation as a smear campaign, orchestrated by disgruntled ex-employees. He smiled in those interviews like a man, trying to convince the world that his hands were clean. The board, meanwhile, held closed-door meetings that lasted hours. I could hear rumors of emergency votes, of decisions hanging in limbo. It was corporate chess with lives as pawns. Then the unexpected unfolded. One of Ethan's old contractors flipped. A middleman who'd been paid through shell companies showed up at regulators' offices with bank statements and a conscience that finally cracked. He provided a signed affidavit describing how transfers were routed into offshore accounts and how certain invoices included line items that never reflected actual services. The man's own legal counsel advised cooperation, perhaps for leniency, perhaps because he feared worse exposure. Whatever his motive, his testimony lit a fuse. Within days, the board convened and put Ethan on administrative leave pending further review. They cited potentially serious breaches of fiduciary duty. The company's stock dipped, analysts asked hard questions, and the PR machines on both sides spun desperately. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a breath that didn't feel like a held hostage, but reprieve wasn't relief. The legal war had only just begun. Ethan filed a defamation suit against me, naming me as an unknown perpetrator and demanding exhaustive access to servers and correspondences. He wanted names, dates, and the faintest thread that could tie me to the leaks. His lawyers subpoenaed anything that might connect me to the digital leaks I'd orchestrated. For a few weeks, the threat of exposure was reciprocal. If he could prove I'd fabricated or falsified evidence, everything I built could collapse. I expected that. I'd anticipated legal maneuvering. I had anticipated countersuits. What I hadn't anticipated was the toll it would take on me mentally. I grew paranoid in new ways. Every knock at the door made me flinch. Every unknown number that flashed on my phone made my stomach drop. I dreamt of meeting rooms and glowing spreadsheets. I woke up with the metallic taste of adrenaline. And yet, even in the siege, there were moments that felt almost holy. Witnesses who'd once been small-voiced and scared now spoke. The clerk who'd first reached out sent an affidavit through her attorney, detailing how she'd seen invoices misfiled. Tomas, after spending a week in a motel, agreed to testify under the protection of counsel. The junior bookkeeper's trembling hands steadied when she read her prepared testimony aloud in a conference room. It was ugly and brave and defined what justice looked like in that bleak hour. Piece by piece, the evidence stacked higher than Ethan's denials. Regulators widened their net. The DOJ began to make inquiries. It was fast, and it was relentless. My role remained in the shadows. Legal teams argued about unknown sources and unauthorized leaks. I kept quiet, letting the legal process do what my dossier had only started. At night, alone, I thought about the cost ledger of all this: jobs lost, marriages strained, reputations shredded. I thought of Claire's silence, of the way my sister now hesitated before greeting me. I thought of Ethan, pacing in his house, the lights in his office burning late. What would become of him? Was his fall deserved, or would it consume more than it repaired? The collapse was underway, but it wasn't a clean demolition. It was messy and loud and stained. And in the center of the debris lay a question I couldn't shake. When this ended, who would I be? Would standing in the light of truth redeem me in people's eyes? Or would I be a man who had sunk to the depths to prove a point, scarred by the exact methods I condemned? I didn't have an answer. I only had the work ahead: testimony to shepherd, documents to protect, allies to shield. The war was no longer just about exposing Ethan. It was about ensuring the aftermath wouldn't be a free-for-all of revenge where everyone got hurt. I wanted accountability, not carnage. That distinction, moral and fragile, would shape how I finished the fight. Once the cracks form, everything that was glued together by habit and reputation starts to loosen. I watched it happen, like watching a slow-motion collapse you once helped design. It happened in boardrooms and inboxes, in whispered hallway conversations, and the way people suddenly checked their phones more than before. The office smelled different, like ozone after lightning, tense and electric. The first sign was innocuous: a terse email from compliance to all department heads asking for clarification on vendor reliability. On chips, it read like a neutral request, but anyone who'd worked in finance long enough knew those emails were the first flares before a storm. People started pulling files, asking assistants for receipts. The contractors I'd probed called to ask if their paperwork had been received. I smiled into my coffee and kept my mouth shut. Then came the day HR scheduled a meeting with Ethan. I didn't attend, couldn't, not openly, but I knew about it because someone whispered my name in a context so odd that I almost laughed. A clerk who'd handled travel reimbursements years earlier reached out with a trembling voice. "There's something in here that doesn't look right," she said. "I don't know what to do." She sent me a photo of a ledger entry. It matched the pattern I'd cataloged. That was the gratifying click of two puzzle pieces locking together. It meant they were finally looking at the right place. The first public unraveling happened on a Tuesday. Westbrook's morning town hall was supposed to celebrate quarterly win, slide decks, catered snacks, perfunctory applause. Instead, the CFO took the podium, cleared his throat, and said words that sounded like a guillotine. "We have discovered irregularities in several vendor accounts. We are initiating an independent audit and cooperating with external counsel." Ethan's face, usually an immovable thing, flickered. I remember the instant his jaw tightened, the almost imperceptible scar in his composure. He smiled later for cameras, but the smile was a trained machine. The company delayed promotions, froze project budgets, and the chat channels filled with speculation, some hopeful, some terrified. I felt a heat in my chest. Satisfaction tasted metallic. He didn't go quietly. The man who'd mentored me turned litigator. Within 48 hours he produced forged memos that painted his actions as protective measures, statements from longtime contractors vouched by calls I knew to be orchestrated. He reached out to people I'd been cultivating, friends he'd never suspected I had to ask for support. He called the board, threatened countersuits, and tried, for a brief hiccup of time, to make the narrative about him being the victim of jealous ex-employees. I'd expected him to fight. What I hadn't expected was how far he would go to drag others into the mud. He accused the compliance manager of being careless, leaked an internal email suggesting our junior bookkeeper Tomas had handled unusual inquiries, and tried to frame the whole issue as a systems error rather than embezzlement. Watching him pivot felt like watching the last act of a play where the protagonist finally loses moral authority and resorts to smoke and mirrors. People began to choose sides. Some executives clustered around Ethan not out of loyalty but fear of being next, fear of admitting they trusted him. Others started quietly moving files offline, printing ledgers that would make for stubborn physical testimony. The assistant who once called me by name sent a message, "If you have anything more, be careful. They're looking for trouble." Her warning made my palms sweat. This was the first time the game smelled truly dangerous. In the middle of all this, I nearly messed up. A journalist from a regional paper reached out, asking if I had any inside perspective. The voice on the phone sounded young and eager. For a moment, the old urge surged: get credit, be recognized, be vindicated in the bright lights. I imagined telling the whole story, standing on some stage and letting the truth fall like thunder. Instead, I did the only thing that would preserve what I'd built. I deflected. "I'm not comfortable commenting," I said. Polite, careful. I suggested a colleague in the compliance field who might have an opinion. Then I hung up and felt the weight of restraint settle over me like a cloak. My restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. If I revealed myself now, Ethan's lawyers would smear my past, my termination, the rumors, and bury the facts under a landfill of counter-accusations. I had to let the evidence speak for itself, let the auditors trace the money, let the emails and invoices and transfer logs form their own chorus of condemnation. My role had to remain hidden until the scaffolding of his lies collapsed on its own. But the cost of staying hidden was personal and raw. Tomas stopped answering calls for a week. Maggie pulled back her compliance team's requests, saying she'd been advised by counsel not to engage further. The clerk who'd first messaged me stopped replying. It occurred to me then, not for the first time, that I had become a contagion. I'd set events in motion, and people who tried to help were getting burned. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my satisfaction, small bites at first, then a steady erosion. Then Ethan struck where I hadn't expected. He targeted my reputation. He leaked an anonymous note suggesting that I had been the architect of the whole supposed conspiracy to discredit him. The note implied I was desperate, bitter, and capable of fabricating things to get attention. The board received it. A few journalists sniffed around that narrative like vultures testing wind direction. For a night, some old vulnerabilities reopened the feeling that I might be the one who would be taken down by the twist of a well-worded accusation. I almost panicked. I considered, briefly, exposing myself, sending an email that said, "I was fired unjustly. Here's why, here's the proof." But I didn't. I thought of Tomas and the junior clerk and Maggie. And I imagined how quickly Ethan's team would crank out counter-evidence to discredit them. My silence, ugly as it felt, protected them more than any public confession could. Instead, I accelerated the thing that always saved liars: attention to detail. I dug deeper into vendor records, cross-referenced transfer timestamps with flight logs and calendar invites, and ran the metadata on every suspicious file through a second, third, and fourth analysis. I planted a controlled leak, not a bomb, but a pinprick, to draw out Ethan's legal team into making moves that would leave a paper trail. And when they did, I archived everything. 1 week later, the audit team found discrepancies Ethan's defenses couldn't account for. The shell vendor that had once looked like a ghost now had an IP trail that pointed back to a small marketing firm registered in a different state. The signatures that had cleared invoices had anomalies analysts flagged as inconsistent with the company's internal signing patterns. Evidence began to accumulate like snowdrifts. At first it's sparse, then it piles, then it avalanches. At 3:17 a.m., I received a single line from an unknown number. They pulled his email access. He can't send client wires tonight. I read it 3 times and then smiled, a tired, small thing. It meant the momentum had shifted, but it also meant the war had entered a new phase. Ethan would not fold without a fight, and whoever wins will be marked by the scars. I lay awake thinking of the cost. Not the financial cost Ethan would pay for that one way or another, but the human one. People I barely knew had risked jobs and reputations to feed my dossier. I had convinced myself justice required this. Maybe it did. But I couldn't deny a new truth. Revenge was teaching me how far I could go before I broke the person I thought I was. Morning came like a reprimand. I turned off the alarm and walked to the window, watching the city rinse itself clean in sunlight. The boardroom storms would rage that day. Decisions would be made. Tempers would flare, and the legal teams would sharpen their teeth. I didn't know yet whether Ethan would be arrested, sued, or simply disgraced. I only knew I had moved the fulcrum. As I prepared the next set of files for distribution to the right hands, I felt that same cold, calm clarity I'd felt at the start of this plan. The difference now was deeper. The focus wasn't just about taking something from him. It was about whether I could hold on to myself through the taking. There was still a long road ahead. And in the distance, Ethan was not yet vanquished. He was furious, and furious people can be dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, I had the upper hand and I intended to use it. When the subpoenas started landing on desks, they felt like thunderclaps I couldn't control. I watched from the edge as lawyers sifted through emails and memos, as auditors cross-referenced accounts with a precision that made my earlier, clumsy efforts look like child's play. The evidence I'd planted and curated was doing its work, but the machinery of justice and corporate discipline moved slow and brutal. It chewed through livelihoods and left scars on anything it touched. Ethan's world narrowed into a sequence of legal conferences and locked doors. He stopped posting inspirational quotes. He stopped calling. For a man who'd built his identity on influence and visibility, the loss was more profound than any monetary penalty could be. I imagine the silence in his house grew louder with each passing day. He hired counsel with reputations like warships. They banged out motions and affidavits and tried to drown the facts in legalese. At one hearing, he looked at me across a crowded room and for a second I saw not a mentor but a man hollowed by his own choices. The criminal investigators did not move as quickly as the internal counsels, but their reach was thorough. A month after the audit's first public note, prosecutors announced an inquiry into possible wire fraud and embezzlement. The board placed a formal hold on bonuses and executive perks while they cooperated. The contractors who had once smiled and collected envelopes now sat in sterile conference rooms with their lawyers asking them to tell a different truth. Some complied. Others did not. Each testimony was another nail in a box that had been built around Ethan for years. Tomas testified under oath. He spoke with a voice that surprised me for its steadiness. The boy who'd once trembled in a diner booth now spoke as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He described pressure from above, odd directives that didn't match policies, and how small approvals had snowballed into a system that even the junior staff couldn't understand. He did not speak about me. He did not need to. The facts, finally, were louder than anyone's spin. When the regulators finally announced that they would be filing charges against 2 former executives and recommending civil penalties against the firm, the press called it a scandal. Some called it systemic corruption revealed. In private, people called it fate catching up. I tried not to listen to the chorus. I didn't let myself celebrate. There was no party. There was no triumphal march. Just a sequence of legal steps that would, mercifully, make truth an objective thing rather than a rumor spread in hallways. The company offered me a settlement, not out of charity but as calculation. They wanted this to end with as little public hemorrhaging as possible. I negotiated quietly, through a lawyer who smelled of gray hairs and courtroom patience. The agreement included compensation for wrongful termination, a clause ensuring my name wouldn't be buried under corporate statements, and a confidentiality agreement that tasted like compromise. I signed. Money can't replace the nights, the marriage, the trust that evaporated, but it buys time and options. That counted for something. Claire never came back. I learned that in the quiet that follows any kind of public collapse, people tidy what they can and walk away from what they cannot fix. Her silence, more than anything else, was an indictment of the private damage my tangled life had done to someone who never asked for any of it. I tried to find words to reach her, messages that didn't feel like pleas or excuses, but she had already built a life that did not include me. Sometimes I think of the forked path we stood at and wonder whether any of this would have happened if I'd taken a different route, if I'd left the company earlier, if I'd told her the truth, if I'd found a way to make space for both work and marriage before the distance calcified into betrayal. What surprised me was how hollow the victory felt. I had taken down the man who'd stolen my career, and in doing so I'd unleashed a force that didn't stop at him. Colleagues lost jobs. Families faced scrutiny. The contractors I'd exposed were dragged into courtrooms and reputational ruin. For every truth I brought to light, a dozen collateral consequences bloomed. I had wanted justice, precise, clean, corrective, but the aftermath was jagged and wide. And then something else happened that I hadn't planned for. People started to reach out with stories. Not just about Ethan, but about the culture that let a man like him operate. Women who'd been ignored when they raised concerns. Junior analysts whose spreadsheets had been reworked to suit quarterly narratives. An HR rep who'd raised red flags and been quietly sidelined. Those conversations were messy, humble, and human. They didn't suit the past, but they started to sketch a larger picture. This was not about one man's corruption alone. It was about an ecosystem that rewarded charm and frowned on scrutiny. In the months that followed, I took work that didn't make headlines. A nonprofit reached out, asking for help with internal controls. I worked with them pro bono for a while, setting up compliance systems, training staff to ask the uncomfortable questions, and building little institutional breaks that, I hoped, would prevent another Ethan from slipping through. It was small work compared to what I'd done to expose him, and infinitely cleaner. Teaching felt redemptive in a way that exposure never did. Ethan was indicted. I read the motions and the counts with a detached interest. I watched footage of him leaving a federal building, flanked by attorneys who looked more like pallbearers than defenders. The criminal process would be slow and brutal. I did not relish his fall so much as watch it with a curious sadness, a man undone by his own choices and by the systems that enabled those choices. The court became the place where his story would be told in painstaking detail. And for once, the narrative belonged to facts, not charisma. The lawsuits ended in settlements, admissions of procedural failures, and pledges of reform. Westbrook announced a restructuring, a new compliance officer with teeth, and a slate of initiatives aimed at cultural change. Some people cheered. Others shrugged. Honesty, I learned, is often an iterative thing in corporate life, rarely perfect, frequently performative, but sometimes a start. As for me, I rebuilt a life that didn't hinge on other people's validation. I rented a small place with light and a kitchen I used because I liked the ritual of cooking. I started running at dawn again, watching the city wake up and feeling ache in my muscles that had nothing to do with anger. Sometimes I would pass by the old Westbrook building and feel a curious emptiness, like a room you once loved that now echoes with someone else's laughter. People asked me, after the dust settled, whether I regretted it. The question was taken as moral ledger. Did the ends justify the means? I couldn't answer simply. There were moments when I lay awake and wished I'd walked away, and that the slow burn of rebuilding would have been kinder than the sharpness of this war. But there were also moments when I read Tomas's messages, the ones where he said he could sleep now, or when a former colleague thanked me for making it safe to hide malfeasance behind charm. Those small mercies balanced the cost in a way that didn't erase it but made it meaningful. The truth, whatever it is worth, is that revenge does not return you to the person you were. It alters you. In my case, it stripped away illusions about mentors, marriage, and the way institutions protect themselves. It also taught me a dangerous lesson, that sometimes the only way to fix what's broken is to be the one willing to pry open the wound. That willingness is not noble by default. It is complicated, costly, and often lonely. On a late autumn afternoon, I opened a letter from a woman who'd been hired after the scandal. She wrote to thank me for the work I'd helped set in motion, and to say that she felt safer speaking up now. Her letter smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. It was small, ordinary, and it moved me more than any courtroom victory. Justice, I realized, is less about a dramatic finale and more about the quiet rebuilding that follows. I kept a single thing from the whole ordeal, a worn receipt I'd found tucked in one of the shell vendor's folders. A tiny, meaningless piece of paper that somehow survived the audit's churn. It hangs pinned to a corkboard in my kitchen, a reminder that small details matter, that paper trails are stubborn things, and that people who look away make room for damage. Sometimes I touch it and think of all I lost and all I salvaged. In the end, the man who humiliated me lost his empire. I reclaimed my name and, in a way I hadn't expected, a measure of peace. But peace was not a trophy or a headline. It was the quiet of mornings when the phone was silent, when I could eat breakfast without rehearsing defenses, when I could answer honestly if someone asked why I'd done it. I would tell them, because someone had to. I would also tell them this revenge isn't a solution. It's a temperature check. It reveals who you are when the world turns unforgiving. The rest is what you do afterwards. Build something better. Try to repair whatever you can, and learn to live with the parts of you that the fire left behind.